kicking things off, what I want you to understand is that when you're hearing from all of these founders each week and these corporate innovators and entrepreneurial types, you pick up some passion. You pick up that ultimately to be in that role and to launch a company or a business requires at least a passionate place to start, knowledge of what you want to do. I don't know if there's any founder I've ever met that has more of a passion for what he tried to do than Inder. He created a product you can find just about everywhere, Target, Walmart, online, Amazon, every store around. But the reason that he created the product that you can find is a bit deceiving. It is not what it appears, and I'm going to let him kind of unpack that story. He has testified in front of the U.S. Senate. He's raised over $55 million in venture capital, holds 21 patents, 3 degrees from MIT and Harvard. He's an EHour, entrepreneur in residence at Berkeley right now, Cal, otherwise known, some of you. Perhaps most importantly, before any of that, he created his own undergraduate degree here at Michigan because BME didn't exist yet. So he compiled something that kind of resembled it, and that later became a department as itself. Please help me welcome somebody who's here to talk to you with their raw, unfiltered experience as a founder, my friend, your fellow Michigan Wolverine, Inder Singh. All right, well, we got to go all the way back. 1998, 97? Is that your time in Ann Arbor? Okay, so a Pittsburgh kid comes up to Michigan. You start doing some classes here, but there's also some extracurricular stuff going on. It's not just classes you do. You got some legs that like to move. What happened there?
So I think one thing I took advantage of at Michigan was the opportunity to just do extracurricular activities and started a number of organizations here. One was a fraternity. One was a morale society with a bunch of friends to sort of pump up people. By the way, how many of you guys know the chant, "It's good to be a Michigan Wolverine"? Okay, so that was created in like the 60s, and then it kind of died, and it was that group that brought it back. It was one of my very, very close friends, Ankur Agarwal, that brought that back to the Michigan Stadium, so I'm very proud of that. Anyhow, so, and then I started an organization called Dance Marathon. Do you guys know Dance Marathon, Michigan? So I'm the founder of Dance Marathon, and that organization changed my life in terms of what I wanted to do.
Well, don't stop there. How did it change your life? What do you mean?
It was this, like, seeing the impact you could have on a person at scale. We were raising funds and supporting children undergoing physical rehabilitation, and perhaps more importantly, inspiring our fellow students that they could have an impact even while they were in school. And I saw that and I said, I want that. Maybe I'll tell the story at some point. Do you want me to tell it now?
Yeah, tell the story of that.
There's a story I like to tell about a little girl named Allison Lawrence, and I get choked up when I tell it, so I'm not a very emotional guy, but I sometimes get choked up when I tell it. I remember, this is like 27 years ago, so like my memory fades on a lot of things, but I remember this one distinctly. And there's this 8-year-old girl named Allison Lawrence. Her heart stopped beating for 91 seconds, and they revived her with an experimental therapy. And this girl was considered one of the miracle children that we were helping support through her rehabilitation in coming off of that episode. And I want you to picture the situation that her parents went through. She was on the table, her heart's not beating, they revive her. When she wakes up, she can't really move. Like, she can move her eyeballs, but she's having trouble doing almost everything else. She had to relearn how to walk, how to talk over a several-year period. And I remember hearing her parents on the stage at Dance Marathon telling the story to the students that were there, a couple hundred students that were there. And like, everyone's like, there's tears running down their faces. And I'm looking up at the screen, watching them, and I feel a tug on my leg. And I look down and I see smiling, shining Allison Lawrence's face, and she's like, that's me. It's that moment that changed my life. And I said, I want that again. How do I feel that again? And so since that time, I basically pursued avenues to learn how to build organizations early in my career, and then social impact organizations, whether they were nonprofit or for-profit. Sorry for getting choked up, guys. I'm sorry.
I don't think any of you guys mind. So, let's take that back for a second here. What was it that led you to think that, okay, I need to create an organization, I need to create a fundraiser, I need to create this thing to help you identified a need and a cause you wanted to help, but how did you understand what the deployment mechanism or medium would be to actually assist and facilitate something to be changed with that?
I cheated. I went to Penn State for a semester and I saw what they were doing. They had a dance marathon for us. But like when I came back to campus, I remember hearing when I was a student, this is 27 years ago, I remember hearing when I was a student about how everyone wanted to do great things when they got into the real world and their aspirations post-graduation. And I kept thinking to myself, wow, look at the resources you have while you're here. It's amazing. And why can't we do something now? And it was a small way of kind of saying to my fellow students, let's go do it. I'll be really honest, and if there's any professors in the class, you're probably not going to like this. I probably went to 20% of my classes while I was an undergraduate student. I spent a lot of time doing extracurricular activities, and I learned a ton. And so one of the things that I would tell you, and there's lessons that I learned like in college doing Dance Marathon that I took with me for the next 20 years. They've been highly influential. How you motivate people, how you influence people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. How do you motivate people when you don't have cash compensation? Like, how do you pitch an idea that is inspiring enough that people will help you achieve it? And those things, I realized only a decade later, those things I all learned here on campus at the University of Michigan. And those kind of soft skills played out over the next 2 decades to help me build organizations that were mission-driven.
We're going to unpack more about the how and the tactics and what it is that you understood or you came to understand about how to motivate people as we go along Inder's kind of career and journey story. So don't feel like we're not coming back. We're going to touch on that. You graduate from U of M, and then life takes you over to the Clinton Initiative?
Well, first I went out to Silicon Valley, armed with a bunch of idealism about like building companies that made an impact in the world, and spent 4 years out there. It was awesome. I got to see, you guys call this Web 1.0. We didn't call it that back then. Got to see some amazing organizations. One of the companies I worked at went public very, very fast. It was one of the 10 fastest companies to ever go public. And it shot up through the roof, and it crashed and burned within 6 months. And I lost more money that year when I was 22 years old than I made in my salary because of my options were underwater, if those of you that know what that means. So it was a crazy experience, but I learned a lot. It took me away from the things that I cared about. I was doing B2B software, and for me, that wasn't where I found satisfaction. There are people who find a ton of satisfaction in that world, but for me, it wasn't where I found satisfaction. And but I learned a lot. So I was lost a little bit at the end of my 4 years and went back to graduate school and ended up just spending a lot of time doing graduate degrees. And no one needs 3 graduate degrees. I just happen to have them because I was lost for a while. So.
Okay. I told them last week when I was talking to the twins over there that I would produce a glossary to send out to them of terminology. I don't want to let that moment go. Give them the context about what options are, what that means, and then sure. B2B is business to business, the same way B2C is business to consumer. Tell them about options.
Yeah, I mean, options are free things you get from a company that if the company is successful, you can convert them into shares and make a lot of money. And I mean, that's a simple, very simple way to.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about it, you're going to get paid a salary, you're going to get your benefits, but then options are a whole nother avenue for your compensation.
It's equity. If you've heard about the equity component of your compensation, it's like partial ownership. It's not really partial ownership because it's not a share. It's an option to buy a share. So when you convert it, you have to pay something to do that. You become a partial owner in the company. Does that make sense? Great.
So you're feeling lost, you go to grad school out in Boston, get a couple degrees, and this sparks your interest in public health?
Yeah, so I was up at Harvard and MIT studying. It was cool to be on those campuses. And I developed a passion for infectious disease work. And I thought, wow, I want to paint a picture for the era that we were in, right? I'm going to tell you a story that was recanted to me by a professor of mine there. And I think this paints the picture. And if you guys don't know this context, you really should, which is, he used to tell a story. This is Malcolm Cutler. And he used to tell a story about how he went to Malawi, a country in Africa. And he went there in the 80s, and 80% of the Ministry of Finance had filled positions. 20% didn't, but that was natural attrition, right? 80% capacity at the Ministry of Finance. They were functioning. He went back 10 years later, and only 40% of the positions were filled. 60% were empty. And he said the reason for that was that HIV/AIDS had killed so many adults in their productive years of life. HIV/AIDS was tearing countries out from the middle. It was not a disease of people with low income. It was a disease that was indiscriminately killing adults in their productive years of life. There were treatments available, but they weren't getting to the people who needed them in those countries. And there was a lot of fear that children would grow up without parents as orphans, and there would be a ton of terrorism and problems that would be created for the world. I mean, it was literally tearing countries apart. That was the context in which I became really fascinated and passionate about, well, why aren't products getting to people in need? How can we make markets function so that we can get products to people in need and change the paradigm of HIV/AIDS and potentially many other diseases? And so I became really interested and passionate about that and studied it kind of as a master's student and an academic. And after that, I got this really, really cool opportunity. Do you want to say anything here?
Well, I'm just listening the way they are, and I'm fascinated by it. I'm thinking that there's a situation here that students, maybe you can relate to and identify. When you were at Michigan, you had an experience with this young woman who otherwise had an epiphany moment, sparked your passion and interest in trying to make a change, trying to do something, identifying a social problem you wanted to attack. You go to grad school, you have a professor regale the story, you identify something that you want to fix, you want to solve a market for. Notice at any point in time that his passion didn't just stop there. I was interested in it, but then I moved on to the next blah, 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 blah. So.
Yeah, and you know, like, when we come to the end, just remind me, I'll tell you my like mini framework. If you guys are ever going to start a company or dedicate yourself to a real problem like that's intractable or early stage, there's a whole framework, a very simple framework I have about why you should do it and when you should do it and when you shouldn't do it. But I was searching. Like, when you find an idea that you become really passionate about, passionate enough that you're actually going to go pursue it as a career or you're going to start a company, it's like lightning in a bottle. There's nothing like, when you find that, that's a moment. And for me, it was hearing these stories and studying this. That was that moment, right? I'm like, one day, I want to work on this problem. One day maybe when I'm old enough, after I've had a career in the pharmaceutical industry, I'll have enough credibility to go and broker the deals that will enable products to get to, poor people in poor countries. And so after school, as I was graduating from school, I learned that there was this cool organization that was already doing it. It was under the umbrella of the Clinton Foundation. It's called the Clinton Health Access Initiative. And for those of you, again, context here, after presidents leave offices in general, today that this rule of thumb has kind of disappeared. But after presidents leave offices, the rule of thumb is they don't do domestic work because they don't want to interfere with the next administration. They only do the overseas work. For decades, that's been kind of the rule of thumb for presidents. So President Clinton saw this problem with HIV/AIDS and said, I'm going to figure out how to go after this problem. And so he built a team. His colleague Ira Magaziner, if any of you are old enough to know that name, he was a big name figure and one of President Clinton's right-hand people. He started the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and this is the thing that President Clinton dedicated himself to and his organization to for the first 5 years after his presidency, first 10 years after his presidency. He talked a lot about it. And they were doing exactly what I wanted to do in retirement. They were brokering deals between countries and companies to try and enable the price of HIV/AIDS drugs to come down. That was a barrier to access. It was too expensive. And because it was too expensive, countries weren't scaling up treatment. So that was a big fundamental problem, and they were trying to approach this in a very business-like manner. So I found out about this organization, tried to volunteer because I thought, you volunteer at nonprofits, that's what you do, right? So can I do a little bit of 10 hours on the side? And that's not the way they worked. And they kind of made me an offer out of the blue to come and do some work with them, and I jumped at the chance.
So you took action.
Sure.
At the end of the day, as Kurt kind of referenced last week, as we've heard before, part of having that entrepreneurial mindset is being action-oriented. Not thinking about, not contemplating, but actually defaulting to action on it. So you get go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would say you get the opportunity to go do this.
Yeah, and so I'm telling you the story of my life here, and I kind of want to move to the lessons learned. But let me tell you the story of like how this happened. And this is I'll tell you some funny anecdotes along the way. Okay. So I joined the Clinton Foundation, and my first task, day one, fly to China. So they gave me a printout of a piece of paper and said, show this to a driver in China, and they will get you to your hotel. I land in China. It's after midnight. I show this paper to someone. It's written in Chinese, right? So like I need to get to my hotel. They get me to the hotel. I arrive at my hotel at 3 a.m. Some of this, I think, is so old that I can tell the stories now. Okay, so I arrive at my hotel at 3 a.m., and I have no idea how to communicate with them to get into my room. So I'm trying, right? I'm 20, 28, 29 years old, I think, at this time. So luckily, someone from the Clinton Foundation calls down and says, we're expecting this person to come. Can you, get them a room? They come downstairs, get me situated. I go up to my room, pop on my computer. It's like the second day that I'm at the Clinton. The first day was flying. The second day, I'm arrived, right? And they're like, are you ready to present this new work area on malaria to the CEO of this company that makes malaria medicines? And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I'm not ready for this. Like, no one ever told me this. So they're like, don't worry, we'll present. So we go into this meeting, and it was like a complete lesson learned around like how you engage in a field today, which we'll come to, called market shaping. We'll talk a little bit about this later. So the CEO of Chai is there. My colleagues are there. There's a translator. This happens to be President Clinton's translator. When he's gone to China a couple times, he's been his translator. They're all in the room, and I'm sitting there like just watching. And they're engaging with the CEO and his staff, asking questions about the production of malaria medicines because they wanted to extend their work from HIV/AIDS to malaria. At the end of the day, I'm just learning and absorbing and flabbergasted by the level of detail of questions they're asking to the CEO. There's like 100 questions they ask in a meeting of a half an hour. I'm so uncomfortable with the number of questions they're asking the C-level officer, but I'm watching. Later on that day, after it's all over, I learn that the CEO of Chai has been called away. The CEO of Chai, this context is going to be important, happens to be Indian. I'm Indian, okay? So he's been called away, and he's already left for Geneva. I'm handed his cards and told, you're going to be acting as a Neil Sony for the next 3 days, because he had to leave, and we've got an agenda with 3 other meetings and CEOs there. You're the one that's going to be acting in his. I'm like, I don't look anything like him, at all, but I'm supposed to be him. He's like, they're like, you're Indian, he's Indian, it'll all be fine. So this is literally my first week on the job at Chai. My second day, and I'm handed cards. Thank God.
Chai, Clinton Health.
Chai, the Clinton Health Access Center. Thank God for an amazing translator that took my broken English and lack of understanding and turned it into flowery diplomatic language to ask questions appropriately in these meetings. So this is just the context that I want to paint. So, all right. Now, again, I'll tell you a little bit more about the life story and some crazy anecdotes, and then we can come to lessons learned. So over the next year, I think that my task is to duplicate what they have done on HIV/AIDS for malaria. And here's the context. They had dropped the price of HIV/AIDS by 90% in 5 years. They had successfully found market-driven ways to reduce the price, not just the cost, the price that countries were paying for HIV/AIDS drugs. It was considered a massive success in global health. And I was under the impression that I was supposed to do the same thing for malaria. That was an incorrect assumption, by the way. So I'm doing my work, and I'm talking to my boss, and he later tells me a year down the road, he's like, yeah, you got on this kind of track of thinking that you had to broker a deal. All we ever wanted you to do was do the research on the field to see if it was even possible, like put together some market research and tell us what was possible. But you got on this track of believing that we had tasked you with brokering a deal that drops the price of malaria drugs. And I will tell you, this was the hardest job. Like, I never imagined, like I was 29. Who was I trying to broker a deal between countries and like CEOs of companies? I tried to quit a couple times because I was like so overwhelmed, so burnt out. I was just like, I don't know how to do this, guys. Like, I've never worked in the field. And my boss just kept encouraging me. He's like, just keep going. You're getting traction, just keep going. So something happened at the end of about 10 months in. 10 months is a short amount of time. I know you guys don't think 10 months is a short amount of time, but anyone who's over the age of 40 will tell you 10 months is a short amount of time, okay, to accomplish anything in the world. And something happened at the end of 10 months where one of the CEOs agreed to a price reduction in a way that would make it sustainable for their business. And so President Clinton decides to announce this deal. And there's a whole story I can tell you about this. The CEO of Novartis is there, the CEO of this company that agrees to this deal, the press is all there. And President Clinton tells this wonderful story about like the malaria deal that we've done. He's riffing on Africans and Americans were the same. It's beautifully done. And we announce a price reduction of 30% on the single most important drug for malaria in the world, which enables significant access. The day after that is the day that I was quitting because I was like, I just don't know how to do this. I'm so tired. I'm so exhausted. I lived out of a suitcase traveling to 14 countries over the course of a year, didn't have a home. And my boss tells me that day, he's like, we never expected you to cut this deal. Like, this is not the objective, but you just went after it and like, it worked. So we're keeping you on payroll for the next month. Go take a month off and come back. We want you to lead a different initiative. And so I came back and I took over the drug access portfolio at the Clinton Foundation and started brokering deals around AIDS, malaria, TB, vaccines, diagnostics. It was super fun. And a lot of that work today is called, we never called it this, but 15 years after the fact, it's called market shaping. And it's an area of how you use market principles and capitalism to overcome market failures to ensure that products and services are delivered to the people who need them. And it's a fascinating area that we kind of pushed. But it just kind of shows you that if you're in the right place, I was really lucky. I was really, really, really lucky. If you're in the right place and right time, and you have the determination, you can like achieve things that are pretty cool.
Really lucky, but you also took the opportunity to marshal resources beyond his control in an entrepreneurial way to bring something to bear.
Yeah, I mean, I think 80% of life is luck, if I'm being honest about it. I think 20% is like hard work and dedication, but I think there's a lot of luck, and I got really lucky because the stuff that we did was highly leveraged, right? It was a team of, each program was running by about a team of about like 10 to 15 people. These were not big teams. There's an old adage that, the only thing that's ever changed the world is a small group of dedicated people. I think that's a Mother Teresa quote, and I really believe this because it's that team that was able to do a bunch of really highly leveraged things. But I was just lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. There's many other people that could have done that as well. So
part of this luck then translates into what becomes the next 12, 13, 14 years of your life and sparks your epiphany for identifying a social problem that you see that you want to build a business model around.
Yeah, I got frustrated towards the end of my time at the Clinton Foundation. I saw the way the world really works. And that's even when you have the tools, in this case, the drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines, they don't necessarily get used at the right time or by the right people. So despite the fact that AIDS treatment had scaled up from 50,000 people in the early 2000s to 7 million people by 2011 in the developing world, like amazing scale up, one of the most rapid scale ups. For those of you that have studied the pharmaceutical industry, I'd say like the back of the generic pharmaceutical industry in India and China was built on HIV/AIDS. It was built, all the major companies, Cipla, Matrix, Aurobindo. So for you guys that have studied this, those companies were built. The ones that deliver generic medicines to you today are those companies. and they were built on the back of HIV/AIDS at that time. That's how they became big. And so, like, I saw the way the world was working, and the sad fact is that these tools weren't being deployed at the right time. How do you stop the next outbreak before it becomes an epidemic, or God forbid, a pandemic, if you don't know where and when to start that treatment, to curb it, to attack it, if you don't have an early warning system to get ahead of it? When I would tell that story in 2012, no one understood. You guys understand this because you lived through COVID. If you can't get to containing something early enough, it spreads, and now you're left with hammers to try and react to it. But if you can get ahead of it and you can contain it before it spreads, we might not have ever had COVID. And so that was the idea that was germinating in my head and the heads of a couple others. Can we create an early warning and predictive system around outbreaks? Can we predict how fast they're going to spread, how much impact's going to have, and why can't we do that today? Why is the technology, why is the data does not exist today? So I was asking that question at the Clinton Foundation, and the basic answer was, how many of you guys are in engineering, just so I understand? Have you guys heard the term garbage in, garbage out? Okay, what does it mean? Anyone want to tell me what it means?
Shout it out.
Yes, if you have useless input data, you get useless output data. Well, that's what we were dealing with. That's what we are still dealing with early warning. There's no good data streams upon which to detect and predict. So despite all of the wonderful data in the world, there just wasn't data that was good enough. So we started Kinsa. That's the company I started with some friends, and with the idea of creating an early warning system, getting the right data in order to be able to detect and predict it. People laughed at me a lot when I left the Clinton Foundation. There's a couple podcasts out there that were produced only 3 or 4 years ago, where some of my former colleagues would we had no idea why this guy was leaving the Clinton Foundation to start a thermometer company. So what I did was take a thermometer, the only product that exists in the home when illness strikes, and I wanted to turn that into a connected tool and a communication network. And the idea was, if you could talk to people when they first fell ill, you would be able to collect the right data. Where and when were symptoms starting? How fast were they spreading in the household, which for those of you in public health is a primary node of disease transmission? How fast were they spreading in the community? And you'd be able to get data that didn't exist in the healthcare system. Because by the time you enter the healthcare system, you guys know this. Think about COVID. You get exposed, some people get sick, others don't. Some people get sick enough that they want to get a test or they want to go see the doc. But by the time that person gets sick enough, time has elapsed and spread has already occurred. If you can get it at those first signs or symptoms, and you can figure out how it's spreading, who brought it into the household, how many people in the household fell sick, over what time frame, how severe was the illness, right? We're talking about inception, right? Initial symptoms, rate of change, right? Velocity and acceleration, first derivatives, second derivatives. We're talking about things like speed of spread. Imagine what you could do with that data. So we had this hypothesis that if we could only get that data, we could detect and predict illness. It was a hypothesis. So we built a whole company around that hypothesis. We built a whole product line around that hypothesis. We invented the connected thermometer.
Well, just to pause, did you have any experience inventing hardware?
None. Boy, it's a lot harder than I ever expected. I had no experience inventing hardware, no experience in consumer, no experience selling into retail. For those of you that are working in hardware is so much harder than software. I can't even tell you. The number of ways you can fail in a hardware business is 10x the number of ways you can fail in a software business. It's really, really hard. Because you've got supply chains, you've got product failures, you've got engineering challenges that are constrained software. It's called, constrained software is firmware, sorry. You've got really big challenges with hardware, right? And so we said, this is our hypothesis. I was fortunate enough to raise a bunch of money because I had an unfair advantage working in global health. If you ever start a company, you want an unfair advantage. That means that you've worked in the industry for a long enough time that you understand the dynamics of the industry.
Another takeaway from that is you might not want to start your company immediately upon graduating. Going to get that experience in a given industry might be the better option for you.
Yeah, it's just easier to pull the team together. It's easier to raise funds. It's easier to understand what your pathway is to success if you have an unfair advantage of having worked in the industry before. And so I had an unfair advantage on global health, which translated to venture capitalists giving me money faster than I was expecting. So raised some money, invented the product, launched it with Apple, which was super cool. It was an award-winning product. We gave it away for free for 2 years to get to scale. And then we got a lot of traction with it. That's where normal companies stop, right? You build a product, you get it to scale, you continue running the business. But that was only step one in our journey. Once we got to scale, we had to get years of data upon which to train our models. For those of you that are in engineering, you know what that means today. You've heard of AI, right? If I would have said that in 2012, no one would have understood what I was saying. We had to train our models. We trained our models to predict flu. Why? Because it happens every year. We thought to ourselves, if we can predict flu, we can detect other things. We can look for anomalous situations. If we can predict where and when flu is spreading, we can detect when it's not within the 95th confidence interval of flu or cold. It deviates, so something else is out there. It was an anomaly detection system as well as a flu prediction system. Took 3 years to do that. After that, we had to go build a business, which is what I pitched all our venture capitalists on, around selling the data. So I'm going to pause here for a second, right? So these 3 phases of what we had to do. Build the sensor, get the data and train the models, build the data business. Create a market that has never existed before on outbreak analytics. People have never been able to, there's never been an entity that has sold outbreak analytics data to anyone. So we had to create a new market that didn't exist, which is market creation, and that's really expensive. Step 1, when we created the sensor, was taking a legacy product, the age-old thermometer, and turning it into something that didn't exist. A lot of VCs up front, when I was first pitching the company, would tell me, don't do the hardware, do something in software to get the data, we'll fund you. We don't like hardware. Hardware sucks as an investment. But I was like, what am I gonna do in software that's gonna enable me to get this data? I have this existing tool that 70% of the world uses when someone first falls ill. By the way, it's not you guys. You guys do not use thermometers. I can guarantee you very few of you guys use thermometers. You are single, individuals and healthy years. The people who use thermometers are families with young kids, i.e. the spreaders of disease. They're families with elderly parents, i.e. the vulnerable. They're frontline workers who live in larger families. Why? Because the larger the family, the more you get sick. And so those are the entities that use thermometers. Those also happen to be the spreaders of disease. So it was perfectly aligned with our mission. I'm like, there's an existing tool there. Let's go use that. So that's what we did. It was a really complicated business. The science worked. Here's the punchline. The science worked better than I could have possibly imagined, 10x better than I could have possibly imagined. We grew to $35 million in annual revenue. We sold over $100 million in total sales after raising $50 million from venture capitalists. And at the end of the day, we sold for fractions of pennies on the dollar the company for other reasons. We had $20 million in revenue, and we sold for, at the very end, we peaked at 35, we had $20 million in annual revenue, and we ended up we were forced to sell the company for pennies on the dollar. So it worked scientifically, but the company failed. Now, I want you to put this in perspective. I've dedicated my life to infectious disease, to using markets to deliver products and services around infectious disease, to curbing infectious disease. I spent 11 and a half years building this company, 90-hour weeks. My wife, after we got married, worked at the company as a senior executive. I would go to work with my wife and my dog. I would come back. It was 24/7 Kinsa. That's all we did for a decade. And at the end of the day, after having a career in nonprofit and a founder's salary in my mid-40s, I sold it for fractions of pennies on the dollar, and I didn't make a dime. In fact, I lost a boatload of money on it. So that's the end story.
So be inspired by that. So That's a very summed up way to categorize all of that.
Yep.
Unpack for them a little bit about why it didn't work. Because, in all realities, we hear that story, right? $35 million, 5 million users out there. Everything sounds like it's going great.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you got pandemic, which is like, man, the opportunity is there.
You make mistakes, and there was a couple mistakes that I made. One of the bigger mistakes that I made is a decision I would still make to this day. It was when the pandemic hit. If you ever want to take a look at this, so there's a bunch of data out there. You can look up Kinsa, Inder, Rachel Maddow, or Kinsa, Inder, New York Times, and you'll find a ton of stories out there on how effectively this worked. It worked. We were very fortunate to have a New York Times reporter. If you guys followed the pandemic, for those of you that were really actively following the pandemic, you might have heard Donald McNeil from the New York Times speaking a lot. Donald McNeil's a luminary. He believed us because I'd been giving him data for 5 years. He just believed us. He had published stuff well before the pandemic on how we were predicting flu way ahead of the CDC. So he believed us, and so I called him. I remember. I think I want to get to lessons learned, but I want to tell you an anecdote. I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, so how many of you guys were deeply following the news during the pandemic at the beginning? This would have been when you guys, I guess, were 15, 16, so for the undergraduates, that's right, somewhere around there? Somewhat, okay. This is the time, this was March 2020, and there were first cases in King County, Washington, and Santa Clara County, California. There were 3 cases of COVID. And so we said, let's go look at our data. Let's see what's actually happening in the country. So we created this anomaly detection system. We can accurately forecast flu. Let's look what's outside of the confidence intervals. Let's look at what's abnormal. It's not flu, it's not cold. It's something else. Let's go look at this. And we turned it on its head. And when we looked at that, there were hot spots in so many parts of the country, in Florida, in New York, in Michigan. It was crazy. And we looked at the data, and I'm like, guys, you got to go do the science again. You got to go look at the code again. This does not seem right. This is implying that we're about to see a massive surge in 14, 18 days. There'll be cases everywhere. And so they did the homework. They came back, and they're like, that's what the anomaly detection system shows. It was a Saturday night. The former head of the FDA, the former dean of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, probably the top school of public health in the country, and the former New York State Health Commissioner, who's the CEO of Kaiser Permanente, the biggest health system in the United States, jump on the phone with me. One of them happens to be advisor. He calls the other guys. And he literally calls the other guys, and in 5 minutes, they're on the phone. It's a Saturday night. It's our research partners. We present. And we're like, we think it's everywhere. And the basic feedback to us is, it's not credible, guys. You're a small startup. It's not credible. We would see cases elsewhere. So they're like, we understand that the science seems sound. Go back to the drawing board. For 3 days, we went back to the drawing board. It was a little over 48 hours, less than 3 days. And the answers were always the same. And so I made a call. One of the reasons why there is a CEO of a company is to make calls. I made a call despite the objections of about 40% of my staff. And that was to publish the data. So we published the data on healthweather.us. You can go back to the Wayback Machine on Google and take a look at this. We published the data. Donald McNeil, that same day, decides to write on it because he believes us. He calls Rachel Maddow. The next day, actually it was that night, Rachel Maddow airs this. And all of a sudden, there's so much attention on our company. Imagine working for 7 or 8 years, and all of a sudden, there's this much attention in a crisis that you had planned for. This was the crisis that we were waiting for to help. That night, we decided to make the decision to pivot away from our existing customers and to help the public sector. It's a decision I would make again. Every ounce of resource went to helping the public sector. We shirked our existing customers, the major OTC medicine companies, the pharmacies who had been working with us on flu, the vaccine providers on flu. We shirked them. We said this is the opportunity to go big and to help. And unfortunately, we were considered fodder for the public sector for a long time. Until they finally believed us was when the pandemic was starting to wane. And over the years, even though we had some government contracts, they kind of just went by the wayside as administrations changed, as COVID overhang persisted. You guys remember, everybody's tired of hearing about COVID for a long time. It really put a damper on our growth, and it was probably one of the most important decisions that ended up in the company's sale for pennies on the dollar. And it's a decision I think I would probably still make today. It was the right decision at the time. Okay, sorry, I'm done telling anecdotes and stories.
No, sorry needed. There's no sorry. Everyone's sitting on the edge of their seat with their story. Think about that, though. You're spending 12 years of your life. You're dedicating the most prime years of your career. Your family's invested in this. Your everything is invested in this. The opportunity of a lifetime seems to present itself in a very unorthodox way that you couldn't expect or predict. And then it doesn't pan out. Inder was here in 2015, way before any sense that this is going to happen. These are some of the remarks he made.
I remember reading an article about how founders tend to take on the world on their shoulders. They have these acute emotional swings up and acute emotional swings down. Like within one day, you can feel this elated and completely and utterly depressed such that you can't even do work. And I remember reading this article and I'm like, this is never going to happen to me. I'm like, I've been through startups before. This is never going to happen to me. I was the first employee of a startup, right?
And thinking about those emotional swings that you talked about having others predict would happen, what was your experience as a founder?
I never thought it would happen to me, and it started happening to me a lot, and that was probably 2015 when it started happening to me. So over the course of the next 8 years, it just got worse and worse and worse. I'd describe myself as burned out by 2017. My board knew, everybody knew around it. I was not nearly as effective, but I kept going. It's hard. I mean, from an investor perspective, most founders that are like at burnout, maybe the company survives for a year or two. We survived for a little longer than that, but it was hard. It was really hard. So I want to put this in perspective for you. How many of you have started a company? Anybody? Okay. I think that most founders are a little crazy. They are. Why? Because you have to believe that you're going to accomplish something that others have never accomplished. And you're a glutton for punishment. Knowing what I know now and how hard it is, like, you're a glutton for punishment. It's very lonely. It's very hard. It's mentally and emotionally exhausting. There's very few people for you to talk to, except for your co-founders. It's really hard. Now, like, just to contrast this, I remember it was 2010, and I'm going back to my Clinton days. I remember it was 2010, my boss calls me, and he's like, South Africa is about to run out of funding. They've got 9 months of funding left for HIV/AIDS treatment. I need you to bring your team down here because we need to broker some deals that drop the price of drugs to enable that. That was pressure. We flew down the next day and we supported the South African government. South Africa had the most number of HIV/AIDS cases that were on treatment at the time. That was pressure. Despite how much pressure and how big that opportunity felt, I never felt more pressure than when I was the founder and CEO of Kinsa. And it's because it's your baby. It's on your shoulders. I don't know, like, if you're a founder who's been through this 3 years, you can relate. I don't know anyone else who can relate to this. But it's hard. So when you think about starting something, I encourage you to think deeply about whether you really want to do it. And to those of you that do, it will be the experience of a lifetime. But it's also very, very hard. Just to put it in contrast.
Well, and further defining this is you did this experience, at least in terms of being a founder, without a partner.
Yeah, have a co-founder. I would always recommend finding a co-founder. It's hard to find a good co-founder, someone you truly trust, someone who complements your skill sets, someone who you're not going to micromanage, someone who's in it with you. If you can find a co-founder like that, hold on to them. If you can find colleagues who you hire over time who act in that way, hold on to them. So I'm gonna take a step back and just sort of give you my framework for why you should start a company, why you shouldn't, why and when you should start a company, and why and when you shouldn't.
Pay attention, this is your moment.
There are 3 and only 3 reasons why you start a company, any organization, or you join one with less than 10 people. Because when you join one with less than 10 people, maybe it's 8 depending on the company, when you join that early, you're essentially a co-founder, right? And none of them is compensation. None of these reasons has anything to do with what they're going to pay you, okay? Those 3 reasons are, number 1, you are so passionate about the problem you are trying to solve that if you spent 10 years working on it and it failed, you might have a chip on your shoulder, but you'd be proud of yourself. You're so passionate about the problem, not the technology, not the product, the problem you're trying to solve. 2, it's a group of people you just want to work with. It's like dribbling a ball down the basketball court. You don't look, you pass, you know they're there. It's like that kind of team. You want to work with these people because you just love working with these people. And 3, you've planned it effectively such that you're getting feedback. There's proxies for your success. You're getting feedback along the way saying you're heading in the right direction. I know that sounds trivial, but it matters. I don't know anyone who can work for 10 years without getting some level of feedback that's encouraging to them. The incentives need to be aligned. You need to plan it effectively to say, at this, like if we achieve this step along the way, that's positive reinforcing feedback that we're heading in the right direction. Those are the 3 reasons. If all 3 of those reasons are true, run as fast as you can and go do that thing, because it's like lightning in a bottle. You will not find that more than once or twice or 3 times in your life. Like, do it. If 2 of the 3 things are true, consider it. If one of the 3 things is true, run as fast away from that as you can, because it will suck the energy away from you over time.
Like a black hole.
Yes. Those 3 things need to be true. So that's my framework for you guys. And if it's true, man, what an experience it's going to be. It's going to be amazing. Run as fast as you can. Even if they pay you nothing, run as fast as you can. So that's my framework around this, in case that's helpful, guys.
It's pretty great. I would love to take more time and have questions, but we are at time. Please bring your questions up to the stage and help me thank Inder for coming out today.